Hello, and welcome to our podcast on the science of essay writing. This may seem a little strange right now, but let's go ahead and get into this and see if we can explain what we mean. So first off, let's use a metaphor here. Let's talk about something that's not writing. Go ahead and think back to science class for a little bit and think about making graphs in math or science. And think about the two types of variables that go on your graphs. They should be the independent variable and then the dependent variable. So let's see what those mean. An independent variable is something that is constant, meaning that it is not the thing that is changing in your experiment. For example, time. No matter what I do, time is going to keep going. And so if I'm running my experiment about weather in Colorado, the independent variable, meaning the thing that I don't have any control over because it just keeps on going, is time. Therefore, that's going to go across our horizontal axis, so the one that goes side to side across the bottom. Another thing to think about in terms of an independent variable might be the definition of a word, as we start to kind of think about how essays might be used in an English classroom. So for example, if we were asked to write an essay on foreshadowing, the definition of foreshadowing does not change. Foreshadowing in one text is the same as foreshadowing in another text. And so that is our constant. That is our item that doesn't change. That is the independent variable. If we look at our other variable, we have a dependent. This is the item in an experiment that will change. They are variable. They depend on the other variable. Meaning, if I have a pot of water and I'm going to go ahead and put some heat under it, the longer I heat it, that's the independent variable, the hotter it will get. That is the dependent variable. So the temperature of the water is dependent on time. If I heat it for 1 minute, it gets to be X amount of degrees, but if I heat it for much longer, it's going to be much hotter. And so some examples of dependent variables might be something like the amount of something. The longer we don't shovel our driveway, the more snow we have. The longer we don't cut the grass, the longer the grass grows, something like that. And so one example as we tie this back into essay writing is this. If our independent variable, meaning the thing that doesn't change, is, say, a definition, maybe foreshadowing, then the dependent variable is going to be the specific text that we are comparing to that definition. For example, if a question is something like, examine the use of foreshadowing in the short story To Build a Fire, the independent variable is foreshadowing and its definition. The dependent variable, meaning how it's going to be applied, is going to be how it applies to this particular text, To Build a Fire. If we were to say, discuss the use of foreshadowing in To Build a Fire and To Kill a Mockingbird, the constant is still going to be the definition of foreshadowing. That's not going to change between the two texts. But then how it shows up is going to be the dependent variable in those two different texts. So here are some examples from some intentionally comic graphs. The ability to draw mountains over time. It seems that the ability increases over time. Perhaps as you are adding more and more peaks and valleys, your mountains look better. Here's an example of time across the bottom and the rating of a specific type of stock or bond here, that over time, based on 1990 all the way through 2005, the percentage of this has decreased. And so the independent variable is time. Time just keeps on going. But the percentage of that depends on time. The longer the time, the less it is worth. Another example here, maybe you have the background knowledge from Star Wars, but basically you can see time going across the bottom, and then you can see the population of Alderaan, which was basically one of the planets destroyed by the Death Star. And so as time went on, all of a sudden the population suddenly decreased to zero, because it was blown up. But again, the independent variable is time. Time just keeps on going, and then the population is dependent on that time. So in all of these examples, the horizontal axis is the independent variable. That's the thing that just keeps on going, usually time. And the vertical axis, the one that goes up and down, is your dependent variable, the one that's going to change based on time. So basically, the up and down, meaning the dependent variable, will only change as the horizontal moves on. So the more time something is exposed to, the more it increases, the more it decreases, the hotter it becomes, the cooler it becomes. So the independent variable just keeps on going, it doesn't matter, and then the dependent variable depends on the other one. So what does that mean for essay writing? Basically, it means that everything you write must be defined as it relates to the independent variable. And so we have to look at our prompts that we're given in English class, and we have to decide what is the independent variable, what is the thing that doesn't change, what is the thing that is constant in this question, and that can be applied to the essay and the specific text we have. So in academic writing, we must base our opinions, which are going to be seen as dependent variables, off of something, and those somethings are going to be the independent variables. For example, go back to that foreshadowing one we've kind of been hinting at. If we want to say, discuss the uses of foreshadowing in the short story To Build a Fire, the independent variable is the definition of foreshadowing. We can't start talking about imagery or allusions or similes or metaphors. We can't talk about those. The assignment is foreshadowing. Therefore, our interpretation of the short story has to be based off of what foreshadowing even means. Jack London's use of foreshadowing in To Build a Fire, the independent variable, the thing that doesn't change from text to text, is the definition of foreshadowing, whereas the dependent variable will be each text that we look at. Here's another example. Explain the usage of similes in the poem The Road Not Taken. The part of this question that doesn't change is the definition of simile. It's always going to be comparing of two things using the word like or as. And then the dependent variable, the thing that does change, is the text we are applying that to. So in this case, it's examine the usage of similes in this poem. But maybe next week's prompt is examine the use of similes in something else. And so we're going to have a different paper. And so to try and tie this all together, what does this mean? We must define our independent variables first. We must define what those mean for us as a writer, so that way we can say to our reader, this is what we mean when we say simile. This is what we mean when we say foreshadowing. Once we have defined that, we call that the anchor. That's our anchor text or our anchor idea. Then we can write about these dependent texts, the very specific things we're asked to write about, or the comparison. Then we have provided some frame of reference for our new writing. And so the biggest thing, if you boil it down to one sentence, is we must define our terms first in our essays. And so as we look at these next couple things, we have to practice. What must we define first before we can start showing examples of them in our texts? So for example, discuss Wilson's use of irony in his writings. What's the constant? The constant is going to be irony. You have to define what that is, how you're going to discuss it. Then you can go ahead and start looking through all of these writings by Wilson. Okay, and here's another example. Interpret the social causes of immigrants coming to America. We need to define what social causes are first, making sure that we're not talking about political causes or economic ones. And so if that's the point of the essay, social causes, we need to tell the reader what we are defining those as and setting the stage for what type of causes we're going to be discussing in that essay. Now, was Tom Robinson's trial constitutional? That is a different question and a little bit easier to anchor because fair seems relatively subjective, whereas constitutional has some right and wrong answers. We're able to go to the Constitution, take a look at those amendments and those articles that deal explicitly with trials, and then we're able to bounce back and forth and say, here's what the Constitution says should happen, then go to the text, here is what happened. Here's what the Sixth Amendment says, here's what happened. So regardless of whether it's fair or not, now we have a different term as our anchor, and that's the idea of constitutional. But again, we must define that first from our prompt. if this is our sentence in this first response here, according to the Sixth Amendment, the trial was constitutional, our next sentence should probably be something about defining that Sixth Amendment. We need to let the reader know exactly what that Sixth Amendment is, and depending on the experience of the reader, we may need to give a short summary, or we may need to explain a lot more depending on what our audience is aware of. And so our next sentence should probably be something like, the Sixth Amendment protects the right to blah, 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 whatever it protects. Then we're going to go ahead and go to our text, which is To Kill a Mockingbird, and start bouncing back and forth and say, this is what the Sixth Amendment says. Hey, look, he did get a jury trial. The Sixth Amendment also says, by his peers. Oh, those are definitely not his peers, as they were all white men. The Sixth Amendment says this. Hey, there it is. So because we're bouncing back and forth between the independent variable, which is the Sixth Amendment, because that's unchanging, and the dependent variable, which is the text, we're able to frame our argument a little bit better for our readers. Here's another example. Jack London does use foreshadowing in the short story to build a fire. That's someone's claim. The next sentence should probably define foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is when the author gives hints, clues, blah, blah, blah about the future event, something like that. From that definition, then we can go ahead and say, here's an example of exactly what we just mentioned. Here's where he hints at future events on page 15. Go back to the definition, hinting at future events. Oh, here's another example of that on page 25. So we're able to anchor our essays in the terminology and with the independent variables, those things that don't change from essay to essay. But we need to go through the prompt and see if we can figure out what those things are. Then we can start to define, then we can start to compare. So in sum, when you have terms or jargon or academic-specific lingo, we need to define those first, because how we interpret literature or how we respond to literature is always in response to what that definition is. So if we say that irony is this, then we're able to say, here's an example of that definition. If we want to say that onomatopoeia is the use of sound words, then when we find examples of sound words, we're able to tie that back to its definition. We're not leaving our reader hanging by assuming they know. We're also setting the standard for what we believe is the definition and how we interpret the definition. And then we are able to bounce back and forth between the independent variable, which is that term or that piece of jargon, and the dependent variable, which is the individual text that we happen to be looking at that day. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, bring those into class and we will go from there. Otherwise, happy writing.